don't make terrible food when relatives are gathered. Paul, just after taking a bite of the meal, overturned his plate on the table, letting out a shout that echoed throughout the room. The gathered relatives all looked at him in shock. Having never seen someone throw food on the floor like that, they must all feel the same way. "Hey, what are you doing? It's your fault for making such bad food. You're a stay-at-home wife, and yet you make such careless meals at times like this. Who could eat this?" Paul snorted with laughter. I looked at him with pity and said, "I didn't make it, you know." "What?" He froze, making a foolish noise. Now is the moment. The perfect chance for me, who has been oppressed, to fight back. I took a deep breath to compose myself. My name is Courtney Reed, 32 years old. Until a year ago, I worked for a condominium management company. But I quit when I got married, so now I am a stay-at-home wife. If it weren't for Paul's strong urging, I would have continued working at the company. However, Paul wanted me to be a stay-at-home wife by all means. I acquiesced to his request and left the company. Truth be told, I wanted to work a bit longer, but considering Paul's income, I thought we could live comfortably without me working. Paul works for a major consulting firm. We met through work, and as we were both in charge of the same project, we became romantically involved and eventually got married. Paul was adept at his job and had a way with words. Having worked at various consulting firms right after graduating from college, I was impressed by his work ethic and made the first move. I never thought someone like him would reciprocate my feelings, but he did, to my surprise. I was so happy that I bragged about him to all my friends. They seemed fed up, but I truly believed this was the peak of my happiness. When we decided to get married after a little over a year of dating, I was completely over the moon, unaware of the calamities that awaited me. "Look, I'm busy with work on weekdays, so I'll only come home on weekends. Hope that's okay with you." On the night we submitted our marriage registration at the city hall, Paul casually mentioned this while watching TV in the living room. I was stunned by his unexpected statement, thinking our happy married life was about to begin. "Huh? What do you mean?" "I mean, I'll come back only on weekends. It keeps the feeling of when we were dating alive, right?" "Huh, but..." "What, you have a problem with that?" "No, not at all." Honestly, I was taken aback by his sudden proposition. Coming home only on weekends, isn't that what's called a weekend marriage? It's strange to decide such an important matter by oneself without discussion. It would have been better if he had mentioned wanting a weekend marriage before we got married, rather than declaring it suddenly on the day we registered our marriage. Sure, seeing each other less might keep the excitement alive. But isn't it natural to want to be with the one you love all the time? My excitement for our new married life was dampened more than I expected. Perhaps out of pity for me or in an attempt to improve his mood. I couldn't tell, but that day Paul was unusually kind to me. The night brought our first conjugal life, and temporarily, the idea of a weekend marriage was pushed out of my mind. Maybe it was Paul's winning strategy. In hindsight, Paul's declaration at that time was just the prologue. I hadn't even imagined the harder times that were to come, far beyond the surprise of a weekend marriage. 2 months into our marriage, as Paul had declared beforehand, he only came home on weekends. As a stay-at-home wife, I had hoped to serve dinner to my husband, tired from his daily work, but my enthusiasm quickly deflated. Even when he came home on weekends, there were times he would eat out instead. So, he hardly ever ate what I prepared. I had been subtly suggesting, "Can't we stop this weekend's marriage?" But Paul would overpower my opinion, saying, "Huh? For a stay-at-home wife, you sure dare to go against what I say, huh?" Indeed, I was a stay-at-home wife, but that was because Paul wanted it so. I now understood that Paul had made me quit my job. so that he could have his way in our household life. He maneuvered to make me financially dependent on him, making it impossible for me to go against his orders. That must have been Paul's aim. At night, tears of frustration would flow. How did things end up like this? I just wanted a happy married life. It's too late to lament now. I have no choice but to wait patiently until Paul changes his mind. I felt as if I was thrown into a tunnel without an exit, filled with anxiety. As we entered the 3rd month of marriage, Paul started to come home only occasionally, even on weekends. This wasn't what was promised. With hardly any face-to-face time as a couple, what's the point of being married? Can we talk about our life together again? I gathered my courage to ask him again on a Friday night. Paul smelled of alcohol, possibly from drinking at his company. At the same time, a sweet scent, like that of osmanthus, wafted through. I was taken aback. Could it be? I've told you countless times. I have no intention of changing now. Even drunk, Paul was determined to stick to his stance. But this is different from what we initially agreed upon. You said we'd spend the weekends together. What about now? You don't even come home on weekends. I never agreed to this. Seeing my point made Paul's face turn red with anger. I realized I had made him upset. How many times do I have to say it? I will not budge. Seriously, why do you always have to complain? Why don't you understand your place? Paul's attitude towards me, so different from before we got married, made me feel not just angry but deeply sad. Why did Paul even marry me? Unable to bear it any longer, I retreated to my room. When I heard Paul getting into the bath, I sneaked into his room. I didn't want to do this, but I couldn't stand being at a disadvantage anymore. Desperately, I searched his room for certain evidence. Months went by with Paul and I practically living separately. I stopped saying anything to Paul, who hardly ever came home. There was something else on my mind, so I decided to live quietly for now. Then one day, I received a call on my mobile phone. It was my mother-in-law. I hadn't seen my mother-in-law since we met for marriage introductions. Wondering what she wanted, I picked up the phone. Hello? Courtney? It's me. Hello, Mother. What's the matter? It sounded like my mother-in-law was at a supermarket, with noisy voices coming through the phone. You know, Christmas is coming up. You'll be coming to our house for it, right? All the relatives will be gathering, and we'd like you to come too. Oh, about Christmas? Yes, I'd love to come. More importantly, Mother. I decided to probe because I thought my mother-in-law might know something about Paul. Have you spoken to Paul recently? Paul? Yes, I've talked to him several times. He's finally married, so I've been checking in on him, and he says married life is going well. What? I was puzzled by what my mother-in-law said. Married life is going well? Was that what Paul told his mother? How could this weekend marriage be considered going well? Then, it hit me. Paul was deliberately lying to his mother, claiming our marriage was smooth sailing. My mother-in-law is the worrying type, to put it nicely. She's caring, but to put it bluntly, she's overprotective. I've only met her once. But it was clear from our first meeting conversation how much she dotes on her son. Excuse me for saying this, but I think everything Paul told you might be a lie. Actually, I told my mother-in-law about how Paul had declared from the beginning of our marriage that he would only come home on weekends, and recently, there have been more days when we don't even see each other properly on weekends. What are you talking about, Courtney? Paul would never do such a thing. Are you trying to deceive me by lying? Who do you think you are? My mother-in-law was visibly angry over the phone, raising her voice. I sighed, thinking, as expected. She only believes Paul's words. She doesn't doubt that Paul's words could be lies. If anyone speaks ill of Paul, even if it's his wife, she'll thoroughly condemn them. That's her way. I'm not lying. If you're concerned, I can show you a month's worth of video from inside the house. Angered by being made out to be the villain despite suffering because of Paul, I told my mother-in-law that, but she replied, "I don't need you to do such a shameful thing. You're the worst daughter-in-law." And hung up without believing me. I had a hunch it would come to this. I don't know what my father-in-law thinks of me since he's a man of few words. But my mother-in-law probably sees me as nothing more than a convenient marriage partner for Paul. Knowing this, I felt tired of continuing married life with Paul as it was, and decided to put into action a plan I had been considering for a while. The day of action would be the Christmas gathering at Paul's family home. I wasn't sure what would happen, but I was determined to do everything I could. I silently steeled myself for the upcoming battle. As promised, I headed to Paul's parents' house for Christmas. Before leaving home, I contacted a certain person. Paul, oblivious to everything, grumbled about having to go to his parents' house and reluctantly prepared to leave. Upon arriving at Paul's parents' house, we were greeted by Paul's parents, aunts, uncles, cousins, and a woman who seemed to be a housekeeper, preparing food in the kitchen. The housekeeper, wearing glasses and a mask, naturally didn't join our conversation and just focused on her tasks. With so many people around, it was hard to keep track of everyone. "Welcome, Courtney." Despite her welcoming words, her eyes didn't smile. Probably because she had lost trust in me after our last phone call. I forced a smile and said, "Happy Christmas." After that, there was no further conversation with my mother-in-law, and we proceeded with meal preparation. I also helped in the kitchen. My father-in-law, as always, remained silent, sitting on the sofa reading the newspaper. Once the meal was ready and I had finished serving, everyone began to eat. I saw Paul picking up a plate of stew from the corner of my eye. Just as I reached for the rice, feeling hungry, Paul exclaimed, "Making such terrible food when relatives are gathered." A dull sound of ceramic hitting the floor made everyone's shoulders jump. Paul, just after taking a bite of the meal, overturned his plate on the table, letting out a shout that echoed throughout the room. The gathered relatives all looked at Paul in shock. They had never seen someone throw food on the floor before. Surely, they all felt the same way. "Hey, what are you doing? It's your fault for making such bad food. You're a stay-at-home wife, and yet you make such careless meals at times like this. Who could eat this?" Paul snorted with laughter. I looked at him with pity and said, "I didn't make it, you know." "What?" He froze, making a foolish noise. Now is the moment. The perfect chance for me, who has been oppressed, to fight back. I took a deep breath to compose myself. "What are you talking about? You were in the kitchen preparing the meal just a moment ago." Paul laughed through his nose, looking at me with a face that said, "This makes no sense." "Sure, I was there. But the housekeeper was there too, right? I was only preparing the dishes. The housekeeper made the food. Right?" I looked towards the housekeeper, who was supposed to be resting in the back room but had somehow appeared. The relatives were all surprised to see the housekeeper. "Yes, that's correct. See. By the way, this housekeeper, I invited her. Let me introduce her. She's my mother." The housekeeper, no, my mother, took off her glasses and mask. Seeing her face, Paul and his parents were shocked. They knew my mother's face, so they were surprised to see her there. "Ah, weren't you the housekeeper Paul hired?" "I don't know anything about that. I wouldn't arrange something like that." It seemed my mother-in-law had thought Paul arranged for the housekeeper. Trembling all over. "Hey, Paul. You know what my mother does for a living, right? She works at a traditional inn and makes delicious meals every day. But today, she made the food with less seasoning for a home-style meal. Why did you think I made the food? Because you were in the kitchen until just now. Paul raised his voice, irritated by my question. Objectively, it might seem natural to think I helped. My mother prepared the meal since I was in the kitchen. But what Paul doesn't know, since he hardly eats my cooking, is that my cooking is not lightly seasoned like the food my mother made today. I prefer stronger flavors, so I use plenty of sauce and seasoning. That's true. But the main reason is that you've hardly ever eaten my cooking. Huh? What do you mean? Everyone else present, confused and wide-eyed, watched as Paul's face turned pale. I decided it was time to expose all of his dishonesty right then and there. Paul declared on the day we registered our marriage that he would not come home on weekdays and we would only spend weekends together. Essentially a weekend marriage. He never mentioned such a thing before we got married. I was shocked. I couldn't agree with it, but whenever I tried to oppose or discuss it, he would stubbornly say, "A stay-at-home wife like you shouldn't oppose me." And he wouldn't listen to my opinion. The truth about our married life being revealed one after another left the relatives shocked. Especially my mother-in-law, who barked as if to say, "Not that lie again. That's impossible. You're still saying that?" I've always received reports from Paul that you two are living happily together. Don't say such embarrassing things in front of the relatives. Seeing my mother-in-law taking Paul's side and looking furious on his behalf, I sighed. It's about time. Maybe it's time to reveal that. Just as I was making up my mind and clenching my fists. "Paul? Are you there?" The voice of an unknown woman came from the entrance, causing all the relatives to twitch their shoulders in shock. As one of the relatives exclaimed, "What's that?" the living room door opened, and a woman peeked in. She was about 20 years old, wearing a short skirt, with bright red nails and glossy hair. The woman looked around at the many people in the living room, then widened her eyes and let out a dumbfounded, "Huh? Paul? What's this about?" The woman, calling for Paul with a flirtatious voice, looked around bewildered, as if asking what was going on. Everyone except me seemed unable to grasp the situation. "Alyssa. Why are you here?" Paul's shocked expression made Alyssa, presumably his affair partner, tilt her head in even more confusion. "Why? You invited me. You said you wanted to introduce me to your family because we're getting married." "Huh? When did I ever say that?" "When?" "Look, 2 weeks ago." As the woman showed the message exchange between her and Paul, Paul was startled. "I didn't send this." "Then who did?" Standing in front of the arguing pair, I stepped forward. "Nice to meet you, I'm Paul's wife. I was the one who invited you here today." "Sorry, Paul, but I sent the message without your knowledge." "Huh?" Both of them were left gaping at the same time. Yes. Ever since I received the Christmas invitation call from my mother-in-law, I had been waiting for the right moment to strike back at Paul. And 2 weeks ago, while Paul was taking his nightly bath, I secretly left the bedroom and took his smartphone. It was clear that Alyssa was his affair partner based on their frequent exchanges. I lied to get her here today to catch them in the act. The relatives began to murmur upon hearing our exchange. The faces of Paul's parents turned pale. I always found it strange. Why did Paul start a life of only coming home on weekends right after we got married? A weekend marriage means we hardly see each other even though we're married. What's the point? I thought, if he loved me, he wouldn't want to live like this. That's because I'm busy with work, I've told you many times. Paul still tried to resist, even now. I sighed deeply, exasperated. Work? Yes, I believed that story at first. But then I started smelling perfume on you when you came home at night and thought, could it be? So, I hired someone to investigate. Huh? Wait, what investigation? Paul began to tremble suddenly. I pulled out the detective agency's report on his infidelity from my bag and thrust it towards Paul and the woman. I had commissioned the detective agency to investigate a little while ago. Evidence of his infidelity was quickly found, and I managed to obtain a wealth of proof like this. You started dating 5 years ago when Alyssa was just 15. You picked her up on the street and started dating. But of course, you couldn't marry a child like Alyssa. Moreover, Alyssa works in the nightlife industry now. It's unlikely her parents would approve. However, you felt pressured by your parents' wishes for you to get married soon. So, you caught a safe woman like me to marry, to stop your parents from nagging. Once things settled down, you planned to continue dating Alyssa under the guise of being too busy with work, and eventually leaving me to marry her. That's about the size of it. I revealed their deceit, piecing together information from the detective agency's report and the message exchanges between Paul and Alyssa. What are you saying? Paul doing such a thing? My mother-in-law tried to defend Paul, but faced with the presented evidence, she could no longer speak strongly and slumped her shoulders. Paul and the woman looked at each other, trembling. Then, Paul finally spoke up, saying, This is low. Using such tactics to disgrace us, what you're doing is dirty. At his words, I felt a rage so intense my veins were about to burst, and I yelled, Low? What are you talking about? The low one is you, who barely came home right after getting married, approaching me while having someone else, using me, and then blaming me while ignoring your faults. You were just waiting for me to get fed up and bring up divorce myself, weren't you? Well, too bad for you. Of course, we will divorce, but you will be paying compensation to your affair partner, too. I looked back and forth between Paul and the woman, glaring at them with the scariest face I've ever made. Why me too? I don't have any money. Please, forgive me. It was my fault. So, just not the compensation. I glared at the two of them again, begging for mercy, and yelled, Just get out. Paul and the woman, upon hearing my scream, finally screamed themselves and ran out of the house. Everyone, I am very sorry for the trouble. As I stepped back with dignity, sighs escaped from among the relatives. They were all dumbfounded by Paul's actions, speechless. Courtney. I don't know what to say. My mother-in-law, who had believed in Paul and criticized me, awkwardly looked down. Alongside my mother, who had pretended to be a housekeeper, I left my in-laws' house. Probably, I will never visit this house again. Thus, my one-year troubled marriage to Paul came to an end. A few days later, I got Paul to sign the divorce papers and submitted them to the city hall. This officially made me single again. Though I ended up with a divorcee label, the marriage was short, and it hardly felt like a real marital life, so not much changed. Since Paul and I lived in a rental apartment, I managed to get him out without any issues. After that, Paul paid the demanded compensation. But since he had no savings, he had to ask relatives for a loan. Despite working at an elite company, he was broke because he had been lavishing expensive bags and clothes on his mistress. However, the relatives who witnessed the Christmas fiasco were, of course, not about to lend Paul any money. He had no choice but to take out a bank loan. The mistress did the same and paid her part of the compensation with a loan. Both of them started their journey into loan repayment hell, postponing their marriage, at least until they repay their debts. Both sets of parents have unanimously said they shouldn't get married. My in-laws must be tired of being dragged into trouble. and think it's high time they suffered through the repayment. Compared to the year of suffering I endured, earning money to repay is easy, I thought, feeling detached from the situation. Meanwhile, I returned to my job at the condominium management company and am now happily working. It's much better for my mental health than staying cooped up at home. If I ever decide to get married again, I silently vow to marry someone who is okay with both of us working.